Hey everybody, and welcome to the third episode of the Inventory 2024 tutorial series. In this episode, we're going to be working on finishing the server-side background work for the inventory system, such as registering items when they're added to the inventory and organizing them into stacks, as well as setting up functions that we can use later for equipping items to the hotbar and unequipping them from the hotbar. We won't get into the logic behind armor yet. I'm probably going to save that for the end for people who don't want, so that way they can just stop before the armor part and they'll have the completed system without the armor. But anyway, let's get right into the video. So if we look at our script, what we have so far, we've created the inventory data and also specified some type information for the inventory object itself. But now what we're going to work on is whenever an item is added to the player's backpack, that is, if you go to your player in the backpack right here, whenever an item is added to that backpack, we want to register it into this inventory system and also organize them into stacks, since we want this inventory system to have stacking. If we take a look at our types module right here that we created last episode, you'll see this stack data type. What we're going to do is, if we have an empty inventory, for example, at the start of the game, and then we pick up a new item, we're going to want it to create a new stack for that new item, right? It's going to have the name of the item, the description, all these properties that we're going to get from the tool itself, and it's going to have this list of items. And so different item types, based on this item type property right here, are going to be able to stack to different amounts. So for example, a weapon might not stack at all. It might just have one weapon per stack. So you might have one sword in a stack and then another of the same sword in a different stack. But then you might have apples that might be considered a consumable item or whatever you want to call it for your particular game. It might stack up to 5 apples. So maybe you have one apple that creates a new stack. When you create another apple, you want to add it to the same stack rather than creating a second stack. So that's what we're going to be setting up with the register and unregister functions that we're going to create in here. So we're going to create 2 new functions. We're going to scroll down. We're going to do it above these 2 functions. We're going to call the first one register item. And we're going to specify the arguments as the player to register for and the tool to register. And we're going to create another one. And this other one's going to have the same arguments and the same parameters, but we're going to call this one unregister item. And we're going to run this one every time a new item is added to the inventory, and we're going to run this one every time an item is removed from the inventory. So I'm going to add some prints here just to get the calls set up for calling these functions. Okay, so we have a couple prints, so that'll help us know when these functions are running. So this is where we're going to move into this character added function that we made last episode. We're going to remove the print that we had there. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to loop through any items that are already in the player's backpack by the time the character is spawned in. There likely won't be, because I believe that the backpack is created when the character is created as well. So I don't think there'll be any, but just as a safety measure. So to do that, we're going to do a for loop. And we're going to loop through everything inside of player.backpack:getChildren. And we don't need this pairs here. It doesn't really make a huge difference if you use it or not. And then we're going to run the register item function for each of these items. We're going to specify the player, which we already have since this is the onPlayer added function, we already have the player. And then we're going to specify the tool that we're currently looping through, which is from right here. And then we're also going to use the child added and child removed events of both the character and the backpack. And the reason we need to do the character as well is, if we look at a starter pack, we have all these items in it. When we start the game, it adds those items to our backpack, right? But then when we hold one of those items, so say I hold this rock right here, I select it, you notice it disappears from here, and that's because it's actually transported into the character, which is what happens when you hold an item, it goes into your character. So we also want to account for items that are inside the character as well as inside the backpack. So we're going to do a new section here. So we're going to do character.childAdded connect And this has one parameter, which we'll call child. And this is an instance of this. It can be any kind of instance. So essentially, this is an event of all instances. So the character is a model, which is it's an example of an instance. An instance is anything, pretty much anything you could see in the Explorer. So this is an instance, etc. Anyway, so the child added is an event which runs whenever a new child is added, essentially, right? So if you have a part and then you add, say there was like an attachment added to this part, this would run the parts.child added event, and it would specify the attachment as the child that was added. So in this case, the child is going to be the tool as it's added to the character when they equip it, but this is also going to include other things like the different parts of the character as the character is like spawning in. So we're going to want to have some sort of filter which will add in the register item function itself. But for now, we're just going to do inventory server.register item. And then we're going to do player child. And this is the same sort of situation, but instead of child added, it's child removed. So it's when an item leaves the character, when a child is removed from the character. So in this case, we're going to do unregister item. And we're going to do these same events for the backpack. Okay, so now when an item is added to the player's backpack or removed from the player's backpack, then it'll register or unregister that item depending on what it needs to do, right? Depending on which one it is. So now we can test that if we just hit play. You'll notice it prints a bunch of times already. For one thing, that's because of the items we have in our backpack, which it seems like that's the only thing it's printing for. So I guess it doesn't seem like it's tracking the player's character items, but we're going to add some double checks just to be sure, because chances are you're going to have other scripts that are adding things to the player's character and maybe to the player's backpack too, that maybe they're not tools, so we don't want to track those. So, but it does seem like it's tracking the register item. So I'm going to go to the server side. We're going to delete one of these items. And you can see it tracks the unregister item. Another thing we want to test, if we hold a rock, you'll notice it does unregister again, but then it does register. And that's because it goes away from the player's backpack and then into the player's character. So it unregisters when it leaves the backpack, and then it registers again when it goes into the character. But rather than have it do that when you equip an item, like have it unregister and then re-register, we're going to want it to just ignore it if it goes into the character or if it goes from the character to the player's backpack, just to keep it simple. But we're gonna set that up in a second. So it seems like these are working correctly. It runs when it should. So let's start with the register item function. The first thing we want to do, div tool.class name is not equal to the tool, and then return it. Essentially what this is going to do, it checks the tool, or like whatever object is added, right? Whatever object we're trying to register. We specify that it's a tool, but it might not be necessarily. So if we want to, we can just call this an instance. But just for autocomplete purposes, I'll leave it as tool. But this double check to make sure that the tool parameter is actually a tool, and if it's not, it'll return and it won't run the rest of the code. So then we're going to get the inventory data. And so this is a variable referencing this table that we made earlier, because remember how we inserted that into the all inventories table with the player as the key and the inventory table as the value. And we can also specify that this is of types inventory. So that way it'll help with autocomplete, and it'll make it easier to not make any typos or anything. So the next thing we want to do is we want to double check that the item that's being registered isn't already registered, essentially, right? Because we don't want to end up registering an item twice. So we're going to loop through all of the stacks in the inventory. So for I, stack data, and that's of type stack data, or for I, stack data in inventory do. So then if table.find stack data.items, and if we find the tool in that stack, and I'm used to Java because I've been practicing that lately. So if we find the tool in that stack using this table.find function and using the items table, because remember that the items table is the list of items in that stack, if it's in any of the stacks that are currently in the inventory, then we want to return then as well, because that means the item is already registered in the inventory somewhere. So we know if we get to this point, if we get to this area of the code, we know that the item is a tool and we know that the item is not already in the inventory, right? Another thing we want to check is, since we're going to have items stack up instead of just having individual items, then we want to see if there's already a stack that still has room for this item to be added to it before we go about creating a new stack. So we're going to loop through all the stacks and check if there's any stacks with the same item name. Type stack data. We're going to set that to nil, so we're creating a new variable called foundStack. And this is what we're going to use to store the stack that we find if there's a stack with the same item name as the tool. So we're going to loop through all the stacks again. We're going to do the same thing we did here, or like the same for loop right here. And then this time we're going to check the item name rather than seeing if the tool itself is inside the stack. We're going to check if the name has we're going to check if stack data.item name, or .name rather, is the same as the tool's name. Data.name equals tool.name. And then we're also going to check if the stack has any extra room. And before we can do that, I'm just going to put then to get rid of the error message. Before we can check if the stack is full or not, we first need to define what item types can stack to what amounts. So we're going to create a table up here at the top. We're going to create a table called max stack data. And we're going to specify for each of the item types we have. So if we look at our item types, we have the item type attribute right here. We have armor, we have special, we have consumable, resource, and weapon. So armor, special, consumable, resource, weapon. I believe that's all of them. Yeah. So what we're doing here is we're specifying the item type and we're setting the stack limit, like the stack size limit for that specific item type. So items of the armor type are not going to be able to stack. They're only going to have a stack size of 1, and special is going to be 1, consumable is going to be 5, resources are going to be 10, and the weapons are also going to be 1. I'll move this up here. And so now we can use this as a reference to determine whether or not an individual stack is full based on that stack's item type. So if stackData.name equals tool.name and the number of stackData.items is less than inventory.maxStackData.item type. And so essentially, number of stackData.items, stackData.items is a table. This number of thing just gets the length of that table. So we're getting the length of the table, or essentially the number of items in that stack, and we're checking if it's less than. All of this is essentially, we're indexing the max stack data table that we created up here. We're indexing this with the stack data.item type. So this is the max, the limit for that type of stack. This is the amount of items currently in it. So we're checking if there's room for an extra item, essentially. If both of these conditions are met, then we'll do table.insert stack data.items tool, then found stack equals stack data. And then we're gonna type break, which is gonna end this loop. Since we don't want to run this loop anymore, then once we find a stack that's empty, we just want to put it in the stack, and then we don't want to put it in 2 stacks. We only want to put it in one of the stacks. If there was 2 stacks that had extra room. And then the next thing we need to do, if there's not a found stack, so we're gonna do if no stack is found. If not found stack, then this is where we're going to create a new stack. But there is going to be one exception here, because we do also potentially want to add a limit to the amount of stacks a player can have. So we're also going to add another thing here. Inventory server.max stacks is going to be 20. I'm going to set that to be, you can change this to be whatever you want it to be. So if you wanted the inventory size limit to be 100 stacks, you can change this to 100. If you didn't really want a limit, then you can just ignore the if statement we're about to create, because essentially what we're going to do is we're going to do if the number of m.inventory, if the number of items in the inventory, the number of stack data is less than inventory server dot max stacks, then what else? So then this is where we're going to create a new stack. Create new, and this is where we're going to like give some error message saying that the inventory is full, right? Anyway, so if you didn't want a limit to the amount of stacks a player can have, you could just remove this if statement and do the creating a new stack just here, right? But if you do want a stack limit, then you want to have this if statement. I'm going to add a little to-do here. Then I'm also going to add a warning just as like a reminder to add this later. Okay, so then in here we're going to create the new stack. So we're going to create a new variable called stack. It's going to be our types.stackData. I forgot the equal sign. I'm going to specify the name to be the tool's name. I'm going to specify the description to be tool.tooltip. That's a property that tools have somewhere. Right here. And essentially what that does, if I go to sword, /shiny / I don't know, something random, right? If you play the game, if you look at the sword, if you hover over it, it'll show that tooltip. So that's what that tooltip is. But I'm just making use of that property in this new inventory system in order to display the tooltip as the item's description. So we're putting that as a description. We're going to put the image as tool.textureID, which is another property. This is the image that you see on the tool. So if you wanted to, or right now I don't have any images on the tools, but if you added an image, it would show the image right here. And then we're going to do the item type is equal to tool get attribute item type. So that's the attribute, one of the attributes we added. And then is droppable equals tool get attribute is droppable, another attribute we added. And then we're going to create the items table, and that's going to be a table, and we're just going to start it off having this one tool in it, because this is just going to be a stack of one item for now, until this part will then add more stacks, or will then add more items into that stack, if there's room. And then we're going to set the stack ID to be m.next stack ID, and then we're going to do m.next stack ID plus equals 1. And so all in all, we create a new stack, we define all the data for that stack, which all this is going to be useful later for displaying the stack, for checking if it's full, and this stack ID is going to be useful for the hotbar equipping and the armor equipping, because we're going to use these stacks, the stack IDs, to reference the stack data rather than just having the stack data itself. And the reason we add 1 to the next stack ID here, which is defined up here, is because essentially the first stack is going to have a stack ID of 0, then we add 1, so that way the next stack ID is going to have a stack ID of 1, and then 2, and then 3, and then 4, and that ensures that every new stack has a unique stack ID. Okay, and so the next thing, now that we've created that stack, we're going to want to insert that stack into the actual inventory itself. So we're going to do table.insert m.inventory, and we're going to insert the stack, and that'll add the stack to the list of stack data, essentially, right? And that should be the basics for this register item function. And so we're going to test that. We're going to add a print at the very end of the register item function. And we're going to print, we're just going to print the inventory, the whole inventory data. Just so we can see, so every time a new item is registered, it'll print the whole inventory and we can see how it changes. And we have an error, so let's see what that is. Right, I put the wrong variable here. So this is going to be inventory server.max stacks. Because the max stack data is the table for like the max stack, or like for the amount of items that can be in each stack type. And then the max stacks is the amount of stacks you can have in your inventory. So I kind of mix those up, but yeah, let's try it again. Okay, so we can see it printed 8 times, which is good. It means because we have 8 items, right? So the first item, once the first item is added, it has armor, hotbar, those are both empty because we haven't set those up yet. In the inventory, it shows next stack ID is 1, and that's because it added a new stack, which has a stack ID of 0, so up to the next stack ID, which is good. The description is empty, image is empty, that's because the tool has no tooltip or texture ID. But then it has is droppable and it has the item type and all this stuff. And if we go to the items, you can see if we click on this, it should direct us to the item. Yeah, there it directs us to the item itself. So this is the item in that stack. And this also has the name of the item. And we can see the next time it prints, it has 2 items, and then 3 items, 4 items. And it seems like, oh no, I was going to say these chest plates aren't stacking, but they're not supposed to because they're chest plates. So in order to test if it's going to stack the items, what we can do, make sure you're in server mode, like this, so you're in server mode so you can move around like this. Go to the rock, because the rock is stackable, and press Ctrl D to duplicate it, or you can right click and do duplicate. If you do that a couple times, you should get a few different rocks. And then if you look at it, whichever one is the rock, I'm not sure which one the rock is. Right here, okay. Now it says items, it has 5 rocks, which is how many we have here. Yeah. So then if we have the stack limit for resource items, which is what the rock is 10. So if we go more than 10, it should create a new stack. So this is 5. Now it's 10. So it should still be 1 stack. But now it has 10 items. If we add 1 more, then you can see it created a new stack. And now it's a brand new stack with only 1 rock in it. So you can see it seems like the register item seems like it works pretty good. Now the next step is going to be the unregister item. So in this one, we're going to add some similar checks to before, like this right here. We're going to add this same line to make sure the tool is actually a tool. Then another thing we're going to do is if the tool's new parent, because in the unregister item function, it's going to run whenever the tool is moved outside of the character or moved outside of the player's backpack, right? So if the tool is removed from the player's backpack, it's going to run this function. Or if it's removed from the player's character, it's going to run this function. What we don't want to do is run this function if the tool is removed from the player's backpack and then added to the player's character, because that's just when the player is equipping the item, and we don't want to unregister and then re-register, because that's just unnecessary work for the code. So what we can do is we can do if tool.parent equals player.backpack or player.character is not equal to nil, and tool.parent equals player.character, then return blank. So there's essentially 2 major parts to this if statement. If the unregister item function is being ran, it's because the tool was removed from either the player or the character, right? Or either the player's backpack or the character, right? So the .parent property of the tool was changed to something else. So if we check what tool.parent is, that'll tell us where the tool was moved to. So if the tool was moved to the backpack, then we want to ignore this, right? Because it's still in the player's inventory. We don't want to unregister it. Or if the player's character is not nil, or in other words, the player's character is like loaded in and they're not like in the middle of respawning or something, and the tool's new parent is the character, then we also want to ignore it. So either of these cases, we want to ignore the unregister item function and leave the item in the inventory and like leave it registered. And that's why we use the or instead of like and or something else. So then we're going to get the inventory data again, just like before. So this is the same line as up here. I'm going to specify the type dot inventory. Okay. So then we're going to loop through all of the stacks in the inventory, and we're going to check if this item, if this tool that was removed from the inventory, we're going to check if it's found inside any of those stacks. Finding tool in inventory. For I, stack data. Type stack data in inventory to local found is a number. It's going to be equal to table.find stack data to items tool. So this table.find function, I think we probably already used it. Yeah, we've used it here. Essentially, it looks through a table and tries to find if there's something, a certain object in that table. And if there is, it will return the index of that object, returns the index of the first occurrence of needle, which is the object, And if it isn't, it'll return nil, which is why we use it in this if statement. If it returns the index, it'll be a number, so this will evaluate as true. But if it returns nil, this will evaluate as false, which is why this works. But in this case, we want to find the index itself, which is why I'm using a variable and setting it to the result here. So we're going to check if we can find this tool in that specific stack. And if we can, then we're going to remove it. Using this table remove function. Table.remove uses the index of what we want to remove, in which we just got that, so that's great. So we can just use that to remove that specific tool from that stack. And then if the stack then becomes empty, say like at this point the stack only had one item and it was this item, then when we remove that item, we want to remove the stack itself because the stack is empty, right? We don't want an empty stack in there. That's just going to be wasted data, right? Wasted memory. So removing stack if it's empty. If number stack data.items is equal to 0, then local stack found is also a number. It's going to be table.find m.inventory stack data. And then if stack found if stack found then table.remove m.inventory. And then remove the stack found. So it's not a good idea to put this inside here, because then if this becomes nil, then this is just going to remove the last item in the table, which is going to be an issue. So we want to do this instead. And that should be it for the unregistered item function for now. We're going to modify both of these later once we get to the hotbar stuff. There's a couple extra lines we're going to need to add. But for now, that should be most of the code for those. We're going to do some print tests here. The same thing is up here. We're just going to print the inventory. And if we want, we can even do registered new item, unregistered item. There we go. So that way we know which print is what. So when we join the game, you can see it registered 8 new items, same as before. And then if we, let's see, so let's add some extra rocks. We're going to use these rocks to test. So if we look at the very last one, that's going to be the present inventory, like what it currently looks like. The rock is number 4, I guess. So I'm going to look at that one. There's 4 rocks in it, but just like there should be, right? There's 4 rocks. If we delete one of these rocks, it unregisters the item. So then if we check that again, now we can see there's 3 rocks, which is good. And if we delete 2 more, there should only be 1 now. Yep, now there's only 1 rock. And if we delete this last one, it should get rid of this entire stack. And now you can see there's only 7 stacks because we got rid of that one. So now number 4 is a different stack. It's the sword, which was before that was number 5. But now it moved it up to replace the rock stack, which just got removed. So cool, it looks like it works good. Alright, so that's mostly it for the register and unregister. I'm going to remove these prints because we don't need them anymore. It seems like it's all working good. Okay, so the next thing we're going to work on is adding functions for equipping to the hotbar and unequipping from the hotbar. And we're not going to actually, normally we would test it by having some stuff in the, having some code in the inventory client, and then using that code to test it. But we're going to wait on that. We're going to work on the inventory client next episode. And so we're just going to test it inside this onPlayerAdded function. But first we're going to create the actual functions for equipping to the hotbar and removing from the hotbar. Okay, so under these functions, under the unregistered item, I'm going to create 2 new functions. Equipping item to hotbar, function inventory server, equip to hotbar, player object, equip to is going to be a number, and then stack ID is also going to be a number. So essentially, the reason we're using the stack ID rather than the stack itself is because we're going to be firing this from the client, and the client's not going to have the same stack ID that the server has because it's going to have like essentially like a copy or like a modified copy of the same stack ID or the same stack. So we use the stack ID instead, since that'll make it easier for the client to reference the stack that it wants to equip. Okay, so then after the equip to hotbar function, we're going to create the unequip function. inventory server.unequip from hotbar player, and then the other thing we need to specify is the stack ID. So this time we don't need to specify the equip to because we're not equipping, we're unequipping. We just need to specify the stack that we want to unequip. So then in the equip to hotbar function, we're going to get the inventory data, just like before. Okay. So there is a chance that this function might be ran on an item that's already equipped to the hotbar, right? So we're going to add a quick check. Well, not necessarily a check, but we're going to add a function call to this function, the unequip function, inventory server.unequip from hotbar player stack ID. And so essentially the idea here is, the reason we're not using any sort of if statement here for this check is if the item is already equipped to the hotbar, what we want to do is we want to just unequip from the hotbar in case, like, say we're equipping, so say the item's already equipped in slot 1, but now we're equipping it to slot 7, we want to unequip it from slot 1 and then equip it to slot 7, right? But if we just run this function every single time you equip an item to the hotbar, as long as this function doesn't break when you unequip an item that's not equipped, then this should essentially guarantee you'll never equip the same item to 2 hotbar slots. So then after that, there's a couple of conditions we want to check based on the stack ID. So we're going to find the stack. So we're going to create a new variable called isValid. It's going to be a boolean. We're going to set it to false by default, right? So then we're going to loop through every stack in the inventory. So for I comma stack data types.stack data in m.inventory do if the stack data has a stack ID equal to the stack ID provided in the parameter here, and I'm just going to cut it off there first actually. So we're looping through all the stacks here, and we're seeing if they have the same stack ID as the stack ID we provided in order to see if that's the stack we're trying to equip, right? And then another thing we want to check here, I'm going to make so this system, like in this system, we don't want to be able to equip armor to the hotbar because it doesn't really make much sense to hold armor in the hotbar, you know? And you can do this for other item types too if you want to do. So what we're going to do is we're going to add an end here. So if stack data.stack ID equals the stack ID provided and stack data.item type is not equal to armor, then we do valid equals true, or is valid equals true. And so if we find the stack in the inventory and it's not an armor type, then we know that this is valid. And this is also, this part right here, this is also good even if you don't have even if you want to be able to equip armor in the hotbar, you still need this part, because if you try to equip a stack with like an invalid stack ID, like a stack ID that doesn't exist in the stack, then we don't want to try to equip a stack that doesn't exist, right? That'll create all kinds of bugs and it'll break the code, right? So this is good even just to double check that the stack actually exists. So then if is valid equals false, then return end. So if the stack is not valid, or if the stack ID is not valid, then we want to skip that and just not run this. Otherwise, equipping, we're going to do m.hotbar slot ... equip to equals stack ID. And so essentially what we're doing here, we're indexing the m.hotbar. If you remember, if we go up here, when we first created the inventory, we have m.hotbar. If we look at the type definition for it, the hotbar is going to have strings for the keys and numbers for the values. So then, apparently I never updated this. I'm going to change this to be of type hotbar, because that has all the slots themselves specified. Essentially, the hotbar is going to have slot 1, slot 2, slot 3, all the way to slot 0, right? And each of those is going to be either a number or it's going to be nil. And so what we're doing here is we have the equip to parameter, and that's going to be the slot to equip to, right? So if this was 1, it would be to slot 1. So we want to do the string slot plus whatever number to equip to. And this is going to index the hotbar and put the stack ID in that that specific slot. And this stack ID is going to be referenced to the stack itself. And that's pretty much it for this equip to hotbar function. We're going to add a test print. Just going to print the inventory just like before. And then now we're going to set up the unequip function. So we're going to get the inventory data. And then what we're going to do is we're going to loop through all of the items equipped in the hotbar, and if we find an item with this stack ID, or if there's any of these values that have the same that are equal to this stack ID, we're going to remove that from the hotbar. For slot key is a string, and equipped ID is a number, and in.hotbar, we're going to specify the type here, and in.hotbar do if equipped ID is equal to stack ID, then in.hotbar for that specific slot key is going to be nil. This is essentially going to unequip that stack from that specific slot. And we would do this, like add a break here in order to stop the loop and like improve performance. But then the issue there is if we did perchance happen to have two items equipped, or the same item equipped to two different slots, we'd want the unequip function to remove it from both slots. Chances are that's not going to happen, but it's always good to be on the safe side, just in case. So that's pretty much the entirety of this function right here. There's going to be some modifications later, but we'll get to that later. And so now we're going to add a test print here as well in the unequip from hotbar function. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add all the places where we're going to run these functions, the equip to hotbar and unequip from hotbar. We're also going to be able to call these functions from the client using the inventory GUI, but we haven't set that up yet. So for now, we're just going to add a couple of different places where I'm going to call these. So one such place is going to be inside register item. Whenever we create a new stack, I want to automatically equip stacks to the first available slot. So if we get a new stack, like right at the beginning of the game, we only have that one item or something, right? And I want it to automatically equip with the hotbar, so that way the player knows that they got an item and they don't have to open their inventory to see it, right? So we're going to want to equip to the first empty slot if there is one. In order to do that, what we can do, we'll create a little section here. If stack item type is equal to armor, then in this case we want to equip it to the armor, not to the hotbar. So I'm just going to put a to-do set up armor equipping worn armor equipping not set up yet. And then I'm going to put an else. So if it's not an armor item, then we're going to loop through the numbers 1 through 10 using a for loop. And the reason we're looping through the numbers 1 through 10 rather than the hotbar itself is because if we loop through the hotbar itself, for example, right? If we do for slot key stack ID and hotbar, then for every by default, like when you first start the game, the inventory hotbar is going to be completely empty. So all the values for slot 1, slot 2, slot 3, etc. are going to be empty, and therefore when it tries looping through them, it's going to have nothing to loop through. And so we don't want to loop through the inventory's hotbar, we want to loop through the numbers 1 through 10 because we want to find those empty slots, even though they're empty. So we're going to loop through the numbers 1 through 10. And then we're going to check if m.hotbar for that specific slot is equal to nil, then we want to equip to that slot. So we're going to do inventory server, equip to hotbar, player slot num, stack.stack ID. And we're going to break to end this loop because we want to equip it to one slot. If we don't break, it's going to equip to the next slot, and then the next slot, and then the next slot, and it's going to end up equipping to the last slot rather than the first slot. And so that should help us test this function as well. because that means it's going to automatically equip the 8 items that we have, right? So now it shows, prints 8 times. It prints the armor equipment not set up yet because it's trying to equip the chest plates to the hotbar as well. But we're gonna set that up later once we set up armor. So if we look at the last one, now we can see it has the hotbar in here, and it has slot 1, 2, 3, and 4 set up. And that's set to stack IDs 1, 2, 3, and 4 respectively. So if we see what those are, stack ID 1, that one's 0. Stack ID 1 is the special event item, so slot 1 is the event item. Slot 2 is the health potion. Slot 3 is the resource. And slot 4 is the weapon. So cool, that seems like it works good. And then now we could probably test the unequipping function. One good way we could test this, whenever we want to unregister an item, we also want to unequip that item if it's equipped with the hotbar. Otherwise, the hotbar will be referring to a stack that doesn't exist, right? Or like if we remove a stack, so say like we have a stack of 1, we unregister the item in that stack, so then it removes that stack. We want to, if that stack was equipped in the hotbar, we want to unequip it from the hotbar, so that way the hotbar doesn't reference a stack that doesn't exist. So if we're doing table.remove, right after that we're going to do inventory server dot unequip from hotbar player stack data stack ID. Then we're also going to want to, whenever we set up the armor, we're also going to want to unequip armor as well. So now test it again. We can see we have our hotbar set up and everything. But if we delete, so let's see. So we have our hotbar slot 1 is set as the event item. So if we go in our backpack, if we delete the event item from the server side, so that's this thing, it'll unregister it, and that also unequips it from the hotbar. And now you can see slot 1 is now empty. It doesn't show slot 1 here anymore because it's set to nil, which means it's empty. And you can see it also unregistered it and removed it from the stack, or removed the stack itself because there was only 1 item left, so then it became empty. So it seems like those functions work good enough. So now that we know that those functions work, we're going to now remove those test prints we added. And I think that's going to be the end of this episode. And in the next episode, we're going to focus on setting up the client side and actually having the UI visually display all of this, because right now it's really difficult to tell what's going on, and obviously players can't see their own items, so it makes it difficult. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this episode, and if you would like access to the completed files for this tutorial or for other tutorials I've done, then you can purchase the $299 a month membership on either YouTube or Patreon, and then connect your account to Discord, and then if you join the Discord server, you can get access to those files. And there's instructions for all that listed, and you can also just ask me if you have questions or anything. Additionally, you can join the server regardless of whether or not you have the membership, and if you have questions about anything, if you run into issues while you're following this tutorial or other tutorials, or even just in general, then you can ask your questions in that Discord server. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I will see you next time.